Left with 3 days of flour and a stove that ate wood faster than she could split it, Naomi Coulter had stopped counting how many more mornings she might survive, and had begun instead simply counting the mornings, one after another, as though the counting itself were a kind of prayer. The homestead near Cold Springs had been failing long before the blizzard came. Her husband Amos dead a year now of a fever no doctor had reached in time. The wheat crop lost twice running to hail and drought. The last of the hired help gone west toward better wages months before. Naomi had told herself through the long autumn that she could hold the place together alone if she was careful, if she rationed everything, if she simply refused to admit how thin the margin had truly become. The blizzard that rolled down off the mountains 3 days past had ended the argument for her. Snow had piled to the windowsills. The wood she had not managed to split before the storm sat buried and useless in the yard. This morning, for the first time, she had woken frightened in a way that went beyond hunger, understanding with cold clarity that she might not live to see the thaw. She was kneeling at the hearth, feeding the last split logs into a fire she could not afford to let die, when she heard it. A sound so unlikely in the white silence of the storm that she thought at first her mind had conjured it out of pure desperation. Hoofbeats, slow and labored, coming up what had once been the wagon road. She reached the window in time to see a rider emerge from the blowing white, a big man on a big horse, both dusted grey with snow, moving with the careful, exhausted deliberation of someone who had been fighting the storm for hours and had begun to wonder whether he would win. He drew rein at the edge of her yard, and for a long moment simply sat there, studying the house, the smokeless chimney until moments before, the drifts unbroken by any recent footprint, the sagging porch that spoke plainly of a homestead past caring for itself. Naomi opened the door before he could decide the place was abandoned and ride on. "I'm here," she called, her voice cracking from disuse and cold both. "I'm here. Please don't ride past." The man swung down from his horse with the stiff care of someone half frozen himself, and came toward her through drifts that reached his knees, leading the animal by its bridle. Up close he was younger than she'd first guessed, weathered hard by sun and work, broad through the shoulders, dark-eyed with 3 days of trail stubble and a steadiness in his bearing that came, she suspected, from long practice keeping his head in bad weather. "Josiah Hollister," he said, touching 2 fingers to his frozen hat brim with an old-fashioned courtesy that seemed almost absurd given the circumstances. "I was driving a small herd south before the storm caught me. Lost the trail an hour back, and near enough lost my horse in a drift. I didn't expect to find a house out here at all, ma'am, let alone one with smoke gone cold. The wood's buried," Naomi said, and hated how thin her voice sounded, how plainly it betrayed how close to the edge of things she had come. "I've been rationing what little I had left inside. I wasn't sure anyone would come this way before the thaw." Josiah's gaze moved past her, into the house, taking in with quick, assessing eyes the low fire, the near-empty flour sack visible through the open pantry door, the general air of a household run down to its last threadbare resources. Something in his weathered face hardened, not toward her, she understood, but toward the situation itself. "How long since you ate proper, ma'am?" he asked. 2 days, Naomi admitted. "I've been saving what's left for." She stopped herself before finishing the thought, before admitting aloud that she had begun rationing not for tomorrow, but for however many days it might take the storm to break, uncertain whether even that would be soon enough. "You're not spending another night alone out here on 2 days' hunger and buried firewood," Josiah said, and there was no question in it, only the flat certainty of a man already deciding what needed doing. "I'll see to the wood first. Get that fire built up proper, then we'll see about food." "I can't ask that of a stranger," Naomi said, though even as she said it, some small, exhausted part of her was already grateful past words that he had not simply touched his hat and ridden on, storm or no storm, the way plenty of men might have. Reasoning a stranger's homestead was none of their concern. "You didn't ask," Josiah said. "There's a difference, and I'd thank you to let me keep it that way." He was already moving toward the buried woodpile as he spoke, shrugging out of his snow-caked coat despite the bitter cold, rolling his sleeves with the brisk efficiency of a man who did not waste time deliberating once a course was set. He dug the woodpile clear with a borrowed shovel and split enough logs, working through the worst of the storm's tail end with his jaw set and his breath clouding hard in the freezing air. to fill her stove and her wood box both twice over. By the time he came back inside, hands raw and red with cold, the house had begun, for the first time in 3 days, to hold something like real warmth. "You didn't have to do all that at once," Naomi said, setting a kettle to heat over the strengthening fire with hands that had finally stopped shaking from more than cold. "Storm's not done," Josiah said. "Might be another day, maybe 2, before it breaks enough to travel safe. I'd rather you not run short again the moment I ride on." He said it plainly, without any suggestion that he intended his help to buy him anything beyond her safety, and Naomi found herself studying him with a wary sort of wonder, unused to kindness that asked nothing in return. He would not eat what little she offered from her own dwindling stores, insisting instead on melting snow and making do with what remained in his own saddlebags, dried beef, hard biscuit, coffee grounds he shared once the kettle sang. They ate together at her scarred kitchen table as the storm howled outside, and Naomi found herself, despite the exhaustion and fear that had not fully left her, grateful simply for the sound of another voice in a house gone too long without one. "Your husband," Josiah said carefully some while later, when the silence had stretched long enough that the question seemed less an intrusion than a natural continuation. "Is he out with the stock somewhere? I ought to know whose homestead I've made myself at home in." "He's been gone a year," Naomi said. "Fever took him before the doctor from Cold Springs could reach us. I've been trying to hold the place together alone since, and I expect, if I'm honest with myself, that I've mostly been failing at it." "You didn't fail today," Josiah said. "Today you kept a fire burning on 2 days' hunger through a storm that's put grown cattlemen flat on their backs. That's not failure, ma'am. That's the kind of grit most men I know would be proud to claim." Naomi felt something in her chest, some tightly wound thing she had not allowed herself to loosen in a year of careful rationing and careful grief, begin just slightly to ease. The storm did not break the next day, nor the day after. Josiah stayed on, sleeping in the small barn despite Naomi's insistence he take the spare room, unwilling, he said, to give Cold Springs any cause to talk once the roads cleared. He spent his days shoring up what he could of the failing homestead, mending a hinge on the barn door that had hung crooked since before Amos died, patching a gap in the roof letting snow sift into the hayloft, checking her milk cow with the practiced ease of a man who had spent his whole life around stock. He did not ask for thanks, and seemed faintly uncomfortable whenever she offered it. "You keep working like a man being paid wages," Naomi observed on the 3rd evening, watching him oil a rusted latch by lamplight with the same full attention he'd have given to something on his own spread. "I've nothing to pay you with, Mr. Hollister. I want you to know that plain before you go thinking otherwise. I'm not working for wages," Josiah said, not looking up from the latch. "I'm working because a homestead in this condition, left to its own devices through one more hard winter, wouldn't have you in it come spring. I've got no family of my own waiting on me anywhere in particular." Seemed a poor use of a storm-delayed man to sit idle while a woman's whole livelihood came apart around her. "You said you were driving a herd south," Naomi said. "Won't your outfit be missing you?" "I sold the herd 2 days before the storm caught me," Josiah admitted, a faint rueful edge to his voice. "Was riding on toward Cold Springs to decide what came next. I'd been thinking before I found your place that I might buy land of my own somewhere quiet, settle in proper for the first time in a good long while. I've spent near 15 years driving other men's cattle to other men's markets, and I'd begun to think it was past time I built something that was mine to keep. And now?" Naomi asked, before she'd quite decided to ask it. Josiah set the latch down and looked at her directly for the first time all evening, something careful and searching in his dark eyes. "Now I find myself wondering whether the land I was meant to find was already spoken for," he said, "and whether the woman holding it might have use for a man willing to help her keep it, storm or no storm, wages or no wages." Naomi did not answer that at once, uncertain whether the sudden warmth climbing her throat was hope or simply the fire finally fully doing its work. "You hardly know me, Mr. Hollister," she said finally. 3 days of a blizzard isn't courtship." "No," Josiah agreed. "But I've watched a woman keep her head and her dignity both through hunger and cold that would have broken plenty of grown men I've ridden with, and I've watched her thank a stranger for the smallest kindness like it was the largest gift she'd been given in a year. I don't need a long courtship to know character when I see it plain in front of me, ma'am. I've simply never before had reason to say so out loud. The storm broke on the fourth morning, the sky scrubbed clean and impossibly blue, the drifts settling under a sun that promised, for the first time in a week, real warmth. Josie made ready to ride into Cold Springs to see about supplies and word of the roads, and Naomi found herself, watching him saddle his horse in the bright cold morning, unexpectedly afraid of how quiet the house would feel once he'd gone. "You'll come back," she said, and hated how much it sounded like a plea rather than a question. "I mean to," Josiah said. "I've got business to settle in town, and a proposal I'd like to make you properly in daylight, without a storm forcing either of us to decide anything too fast." "I'd rather you have the clear-headed choice of it, Naomi, not a choice made out of gratitude for a man who happened to ride by when you needed him most." He rode out toward town that bright, thawing morning with her promise to wait for him held plain between them. And Naomi busied herself the rest of that day with the small, hopeful chores of a homestead that had, for the first time in a year, begun to feel worth tending again, mending a torn curtain, sweeping the hearth clean of ash, airing quilts gone musty through the long, frightened days of the storm. The second storm came without much warning, the way the worst prairie storms often did, rolling down off the same mountains that had sent the first one, the sky going the color of a fresh bruise within the space of an hour, while the temperature dropped so fast Naomi could feel it happening in her own chest. She remembered, too late, that she had left her one remaining milk cow out in the near pasture that morning, and that the animal, old, and none too clever about weather even in the best of times, would not find her own way to shelter before the new storm broke in earnest. She should have let the cow go. She understood that plainly, even as she pulled on her coat and her husband's old boots, because a woman with nothing left but a failing homestead could not afford to lose the one animal standing between her and true ruin. The wind hit her the moment she stepped off the porch, a wall of white so sudden that the barn, 60 paces distant, vanished from sight within 3 strides. She pressed on anyway, one hand trailing the fence line husband had strung years before for exactly such a purpose. Counting posts under her numbing fingers the way she had once counted mornings, and found the cow at last bawling and frightened at the pasture gate, half buried against the drifted fence. Getting the animal loose took longer than she had daylight to spare, the rope stiff with ice, her fingers clumsy with cold, and by the time she had the cow moving toward the barn, the storm had closed in fully around her, the world reduced to a howling, featureless white. She lost the fence line somewhere in the last 30 yards, her numbed hand finding only drifted snow where solid wood should have been, and stood one long, terrible moment uncertain which direction led home and which led further out onto open, frozen prairie. It was a voice, hoarse and calling her name over the wind, that finally gave her direction back. Josiah had turned his wagon around an hour into the ride to Cold Springs, some old instinct warning him the sky had not finished with them yet, and had ridden hard back through the building storm only to find the house dark empty and Naomi nowhere inside it. "Naomi," his voice came again, closer now, and she turned toward it, half stumbling, the cow's rope still wrapped stubborn around her frozen fist, and nearly collapsed with relief when his shape finally broke out of the white ahead of her, snow-caked and frantic, closing the last distance between them in 3 long strides. "I've got the cow," she said absurdly, her teeth chattering so hard the words came out broken, and Josiah did not laugh, only pulled her hard against him, one arm braced around her shoulders and the other taking the rope from her numb fingers, and began walking them both, unhurried but unyielding, back along a line only he seemed able to find true in all that blinding white. "You could have died out here over one old cow," he said, once they had gained the barn and stumbled the last stretch to the house. His voice rough with fear, he made no effort to hide now the danger had passed. "I turned that wagon around not 20 minutes into the ride because something wouldn't let me keep going, and I thank God I listened to it." "I couldn't lose her," Naomi said, shaking now as much from the fright as the cold, sitting where he'd half carried her near the stove while he worked the frozen boots from her feet with hands gentler than she'd have thought such rough, weathered hands capable of. "She's the last thing standing between me and losing everything, Josiah. I've spent a year learning I can't afford to lose one more single thing." "You won't have to learn that lesson alone again," Josiah said, kneeling before her, his own fear still raw and plain across his face even as it eased into something steadier, something that had stopped waiting for daylight or proper courtship to declare itself. I meant to ask you this properly, in town, with a ring bought fair and a preacher already lined up. I find I can't wait on it any longer, not after tonight, not after nearly losing you to a storm I should never have let you face alone even for an afternoon. Then ask me now, Naomi said, her hand finding his where it still cradled her half-frozen foot, before either of us has cause to wonder again whether we'll get the chance. Marry me, Naomi, Josiah said. Not because I found your fire nearly out that first night, and not because I pulled you out of a blizzard twice now in the space of a single week, only because I've come to love you plainly, entirely, and I don't intend to spend one more storm anywhere but at your side, keeping watch. She said yes there by the stove, still shaking with cold and relief both, and Josiah held her through the rest of that second storm's long, howling night, the fire well fed, and the door barred fast against weather that no longer felt like a threat with him beside her. He rode into Cold Springs 2 days later, once the roads had cleared enough to travel safe, and returned with a wagon of proper supplies, flour, salt pork, seed for spring planting, enough coal oil to see her through the rest of the winter without rationing. And news that had spread through town faster than the thaw itself, that a passing cattleman had spent 4 days digging a starving widow's homestead out of a killing storm and asking nothing in return, and that half of Cold Springs, hearing it, had decided Naomi Coulter was owed a good deal more consideration from her neighbors than she'd received in the lonely year since Amos died. But it was what Josiah carried down from the wagon last, wrapped careful in a square of cloth, that mattered more to Naomi than any town's changed opinion. A plain gold band, not new, but polished bright, that he told her had belonged to his own mother, kept in his saddlebag through 15 years of driving other men's cattle, because he had never yet found a hand he thought worthy of wearing it. I bought no land of my own in town, he said, standing in her thawing yard with his hat in his hand, because I don't want land that isn't yours as well. I'd like to stay on here, rebuild what's failing, put in a real crop come spring and do it as your husband, exactly as I told you by the stove 2 nights past. Not because a storm threw us together, and not out of any debt you imagine you owe me. Only because I meant every word of it, in daylight same as I meant it in the dark. Naomi crossed the yard to him with the sun bright and warm on the melting snow, feeling, for the first time in a year of careful rationing, of food, of hope, of every soft thing she had trained herself not to want too badly, that she could finally let herself want something fully again in daylight, with no storm left to blame it on. I thought 5 nights ago that I might not see this thaw at all, she said, taking the ring from his open palm. I never imagined I'd see it standing here, being given your mother's ring by a man who wouldn't ride on, not once in all the chances the weather gave him to. I couldn't have ridden on, Josiah said simply. Not past a woman fighting that hard to keep her home and her hope both alive on nothing but grit and rationed flour. I've built my whole life on knowing when land is worth staking a claim to. I knew the moment I saw your fire still burning against all sense that I'd found something worth staying for. And I knew it truer still the night I nearly lost you to a storm I should have seen coming sooner. They were married that spring in the small church at Cold Springs, with half the town in attendance, many of them neighbors who had, in the months since the storm, finally come to lend the kind of help a struggling widow should never have had to do without. Josiah put in the crop he had promised and mended the failing barn until it stood as sound as any in the county. And by summer the homestead that had nearly claimed Naomi's life bore little resemblance to the desperate, half-buried place he had first ridden up to. Naomi kept, framed above the mantel where the fire had once burned down to its last desperate log, the split-wood hatchet Josiah had used that first storm-bound night, a small, plain reminder of the evening a stranger had chosen not to ride on, and had instead ridden straight into the center of her failing, frightened life, and simply refused to leave until it was failing no longer. Years later, when neighbors newer to Cold Springs asked how the Hollisters had come to marry, Naomi told it plainly. That she had been left alone in a dying homestead with 3 days of flour and a fire she could not keep fed, certain she would not survive the winter, and that a passing cattleman, finding her fire nearly out and her hope nearly with it, had simply refused to let either dark. It was not, she always added, the storm that had built their marriage. It was everything Josiah chose to do once the storm had passed, and he no longer needed any excuse at all to stay.